Okay, so now joining us to take a closer look at the calls for divestment, what this will mean, and on the other side, big money donors pulling their funding over university responses to the Israeli-Hamas conflict. We have Anthony Chan. He's the former chief economist at J.P. Morgan Chase. Anthony, welcome back. Students at top universities, and we've talked about them, Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, USC, UCLA, they're calling for the universities to divest and disassociate from Israel. What's the rationale behind this, and can a divestment campaign be effective and create change? I mean, I think everybody can think back to South Africa in the 80s, but that was like a big global push against one region, and this is just focused on the U.S. right now.
Well, Sean, the big difference is that today, these endowments are a little bit more complex than they've been in the past. Now you have private equity firms, you have hedge funds, where they're putting their money in. It's not like many of these endowment funds have a basket of 10, 20, 30, or even 40 companies, and they can just simply start selling those and buying the other ones. It's more complicated than that, and that's one of the reasons why the universities are reluctant to actually divest of specific companies. It's very challenging for them to do that.
Okay, it may be very challenging, but clearly these students are very passionate about it, and they show no signs of letting up. Explain a little bit more about why it's so difficult and how this could happen, how divestment could happen. Because Columbia, for example, has an endowment of close to $14 billion.
That's right. But again, if you have a fund with a hedge fund, and the hedge fund is diversified, and you have a chunk in that hedge fund, it's very challenging for an endowment to actually call up the hedge fund and say, can you all of a sudden change your hedge fund and take these companies out? Because that's a real big challenge. As I said, they don't have a basket of currencies. And by the way, the name of the companies, they want any defense company that sells military weapons to Israel. They, of course, want a lot of the companies that provide cloud services to the military in Israel. And again, I'm not taking sides as to whether this is good or bad. I'm just saying it's very challenging for these endowments to actually follow and meet these demands.
Now, in the previous months, we saw some big college donors closing their checkbooks over what they see as a weak response by the university administrators, their response to the Israel-Hamas conflict. Let's talk a bit more about these donors and what that means when someone pulls potentially millions away from a university or college.
Well, many of these are just pulling away new funds or taking away some promises. But keep in mind, Sean, that these Ivy League universities have such huge endowments that if you just have a handful of these billionaire donors basically pulling back, it's not going to hurt them over the near term. Now, over the longer term, if it sends a signal and all of a sudden Main Street donors start to take signals from these large donors and they pull back, that could be a real serious problem. But now, at this moment, at this juncture, many of these large institutions are not really panicking. And by the way, it hasn't been completely widespread. We've seen some large donors that basically have just expressed concern, but they haven't stopped donating. And you know some of the names out there, Leon Cooperman and others, that have expressed some dismay, but have not really stopped providing monies to these endowments.
You know, I feel a bit for the college administrators because they've been feeling the heat forever about as tuition goes up and up and up and up. And you talked about if this goes on, maybe Main Street donors stop kicking in those funds. But what if various state capitals take a look at this and the funding from the states begins to pare back at state colleges? What could that do, and how difficult of a position right now are these college administrators in?
They are facing some challenges. You probably know, Sean, that some are even citing the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, to basically say that these universities are discriminating because you can't discriminate on the basis of color, nationality, religious. That means you can't discriminate against Jewish students, you can't discriminate against Muslims, you can't discriminate against Palestinians. And if they're found to be discriminating, then of course there is some risk that they will have to negotiate with the federal government, because right now there's some that are saying that somehow the federal funding should be taken away. That's almost 30% of all the funding that many of these colleges and universities receive. You mentioned the states. There, that funding is closer to 9 to 10%. And of course, the private funding, which is what you were talking about before, that's about 12%. And then, of course, the rest is the tuition and other charges. So, yes, to the extent that you make all those sources of revenue much more challenging, these universities will, in fact, have to listen and may have to adjust their policies. But it's not automatic that you can actually say they're discriminating,
Sure.
so therefore the federal funding closes, because usually what happens is that these universities will then go to the Department of Education and then come up with a plan on how they can actually stop being in violation. So it's not automatic that if they find that they violated something, unless you can say it was deliberate and really very obvious, it's not that easy to just cut the federal funding or even the state funding.
You know, Anthony, I also want to go through, let's talk about some of the big ones. We talked about South Africa in the 80s. And there was Nike when the students were concerned about that giant making all of its profits on the backs of poor young kids in Southeast Asia. What other big ones have been out there? And really what I want to know, what's the likelihood of any college or university taking a significant step right now to divest as a result of the ongoing protests?
Well, Sean, every major university that has basically commented on these demands have basically given the strong impression that the odds are very low. Now, the students will say that means the universities are not being flexible, they're not willing to negotiate, but it is because of the real challenges. And as to how other events that kind of remind me of what's going on, Sean, I'm much older than you are, so I remember the Vietnam War, when the students were protesting and they didn't want the university endowments to have any ties to the defense companies that had anything to do with Vietnam. They wanted anything to do with weapons. So, and back then the endowments were not as complicated,
Sure.
but it does remind me of that that period, and also the instance you mentioned, the Nike situation. So students are always going to make these demands. University endowments are not always going to listen. And the more sophisticated these investment programs become, the less flexibility they have to meet those demands.
Yeah, it seems like the authorities are a lot quicker to act right now, though, with police going in, but that's a time for another discussion. Anthony, I certainly appreciate your insight, and thanks very much again.
Good to be with you, Sean.